Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here and Happy New Year. I cannot believe that we are now in 2023. This year flew by. If you are new to my channel, welcome. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. Today's case is a bizarre and very disturbing one, and it's also the first serial killer that we've ever discussed on this channel. This man has been described as one of America's worst serial killers, and there's a chance that you might have never even heard of him. Today, we're going to be talking about Gerard John Schaefer Jr. He's most commonly called by his middle name, John, so that's how I'm going to refer to him throughout this video. So John Schaefer was actually a deputy for the Martin County, Florida Sheriff's Department when he was finally caught and arrested for his crimes. And let me just tell you, you're going to be so angry with how this was handled initially, because if things would have went differently, there's a lot of people that would still be alive. John killed a lot of his victims in an area of St. Lucie County, Florida called Hutchinson Island near Blind Beach Creek, which is how he got the name the Butcher of Blind Creek. In addition to being a serial killer, John liked to write stories, and he considered himself a very gifted fiction crime writer. A lot of the stuff that he wrote is considered to be actually personal logs of some of the crimes that he committed. And I've read some of his writings, and it is probably the most vile, sadistic stuff that I've ever read. There's a lot of really interesting information out there about this case. There are books and documentaries, and there are even some interviews with John Schaefer that are available here on YouTube. And this guy really creeps me out.
When you do a work, and this was to be a work, the ghoul, the person, all right, is a commodity. He is a scary character. And when you read this, you get scared by the time you get to the end. You say, wow, is this a real guy? This guy could be around, like that. Because this is what's really scary. King Kong isn't scary. Fuad Ramsey isn't scary. This is scary.
People very close to this case and close to John Schaefer have said that he makes Ted Bundy look like a Boy Scout. And speaking of Ted Bundy, he actually pops up in this case, and so do a couple of other very prolific serial killers. Now, John is commonly referred to as a serial killer, but he was actually only convicted of 2 murders in the end, but he is suspected in much, much more than just 2 murders. And there's a lot of evidence that actually backs this up, which we'll talk about later. Some estimates have John's victim count at least 28, but we'll probably never actually know how many people he killed. Now, we have a lot to go over in this case, so let's just go ahead and jump into it. Gerard John Schaefer was born on March 26, 1946 in Neenah, Wisconsin. John was the oldest of 3 children, and his parents were Doris and Gerard Sr., also known as Jerry. His father, Jerry, was a traveling salesman for a company called Kimberly-Clark, which is a company that mostly produces paper products. And from the outside, the family seemed pretty ordinary. They were a religious family, and they were very involved in their Catholic faith, and the children even attended a private Catholic school. Because of Jerry's job as a traveling salesman, the family actually ended up moving around quite a bit. They lived in Wisconsin, Tennessee, and Georgia before finally settling down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida in 1960. And once they settled down in Fort Lauderdale, the family just kind of dove right into the local social scene. They joined the local country club and the yacht club, and they seemed to just blend right into society. But things were actually not good in the home. Doris and Jerry had a terrible relationship. Jerry earned a good living, like he was a good provider, but he was gone on business a lot, which left Doris alone by herself a lot with the children. Jerry was also a heavy drinker, and he also had a lot of affairs while he was on the road for his job. Jerry and Doris do eventually get divorced, but this does not happen until way later, till when John is actually in college. Jerry didn't have a good relationship with John either. They only ever really bonded over like outdoorsy stuff. Like they both like to hunt and fish, and this was something that they did together. This was pretty much the only time they really ever spent together. Jerry just wasn't really interested in John overall, and they had a pretty turbulent relationship, and John spent most of his childhood craving his father's attention. John actually said that he always felt like an illegitimate child and the product of a shotgun wedding, and he felt like his father never loved him as much as he loved his younger sister Sarah. Jerry and Sarah had a very close relationship. John was always very jealous of that. And it definitely seems as though this intense jealousy that John was feeling towards Sarah and Jerry's relationship manifested itself in some really unhealthy ways. For example, when John would play pretend games with the other children, like cops and robbers or something like that, a game where in the end someone would die, John always wanted to be the one in the game that would be killed. And he later explained that he started having these feelings of wanting to die because he could never please his father. And so this intense feeling of inadequacy made him fantasize about dying quite often. And keep in mind, he's very young at this age. He's not even a teenager. John would also wander into the nearby woods, and he would go there alone and he would kill animals. This was something that he enjoyed, which we know is a bad sign. And then around age 12, John started developing some concerning sexual habits. He became obsessed with women's underwear, and he would often steal them and put them on and wear them around. He later said that he did this because he wanted to feel like a girl, and he always thought that if he were a girl, maybe he would have been loved by his father. He also got into voyeurism, which I'm sure most of you know is when a person usually secretly watches someone in a vulnerable situation, usually when they're undressed or if they're involved in some sort of sexual act. He started spying on a lot of his female neighbors, and things just progressed from there. And John started experimenting with some sadomasochistic stuff, and he would wander into the woods and he would tie himself to a tree, and then he would inflict pain on himself, and this would get him aroused. And he's only about 12 at this point, so he's still very young. And this whole thing is actually really important to note because John's MO was definitely inspired by this little childhood habit that he had in the woods. When John was 14, he started dating a girl named Cindy, and this relationship turned sexual really quick. But this was not a healthy sexual relationship. John would make Cindy pretend that he was holding her down and forcing her to have sex with him. And he later claimed that this was all Cindy's idea, and he only did this because that's what she was into. But I don't think anyone's buying that bullshit after finding out what he goes on to do. John and Cindy dated for a couple of years, but they eventually did break up. John attended St. Thomas Aquinas High School in Fort Lauderdale, which is a private Roman Catholic school. And his classmates described him as sort of athletic, but very strange. He played on the football team in high school, and he was also a very good golfer. Like, some people said he could have even went pro. Like, he was that good. He was also a member of various school clubs, so he definitely was a joiner, but he never really had like a close group of friends. He was just always kind of there. One of his classmates said that John was just weird, and that sometimes in class he would just randomly start talking to himself. And he was known as kind of a creep by the girls at the school. Some of the women who graduated with him said that they would tuck their skirts when John was around or in the area because he was constantly trying to look up their skirts. When John was 18, he started dating a woman named Sandra London. And at first, Sandra and John's relationship was great. John treated her really well, and he got along great with her family. He even went on vacations with her and her family. But eventually, Sandra started seeing some warning signs. One day, they were just hanging out, and John started talking about a neighbor of his named Lee Hainline. And he said that Lee was deliberately stripping in front of her window every night, and she would do this just to taunt him. He fully believed that this girl was giving him a striptease just to taunt him. And Sandra later said that he sounded so angry when he would talk about this, and he would refer to Lee as a slut. And then he told Sandra that he would put a stop to it. And then about a year into their relationship, John started to confide in Sandra about some of these dark urges that he was having. He told her about another girl who lived near him, and he said he would spy on her all the time. He would go and watch her while she was sunbathing in her backyard. And just like Lee Hainline, John took this as her flaunting herself for him just to tease him, and he was angry about it. And keep in mind, this woman is in her own backyard. She has no clue anyone's watching her, and he thinks that she's doing it on purpose. So you can already see this warped sense of reality that he has. But he was so angry about this girl sunbathing in her backyard that he started having thoughts about killing her. And he told Sandra that he had a whole plan laid out. He said he even had the supplies in the back of his car. He said that he would knock her unconscious with a bat, and then he would wrap her up in a blanket, tie it up with a rope. Then he would load her into the back of his station wagon, and he would drive it down the street where a boat dock was, and that's where his father's boat was being stored. He would load her up on his father's boat, take her out to the Everglades, shoot her in the head, and then leave her there for the alligators to eat. He told Sandra there was no crime if there was no body. And this whole no crime, no body thing is something that John will definitely repeat later on in the case. It's kind of something that he said constantly when he was finally arrested. And he didn't go through with that murder plan. I don't know if he just didn't have the opportunity or what, but you can see how calculating and how sadistic his thoughts already are, and he's still only a teenager at this point. So in addition to telling Sandra about these urges that he was having, he also told his creative writing teacher. I don't know why. I don't know if he was close with this teacher. The teacher went to the school counselor and told the school counselor everything John had told her. And I don't know exactly what came of that, but the school counselor later said that he could sense some homicidal tendencies in John, but he just felt powerless to do anything about it. John graduated from St. Thomas Aquinas High School in June of 1964, and he started at Broward College in the fall of 1964. He first started college as a social studies major, but then he switched his major to education with hopes of becoming a teacher, which is scary. By this time, John and Sandra had kind of went their separate ways. Sandra said that she was never afraid of him. She said she just didn't want to be his therapist anymore. John later transferred to Florida Atlantic University to continue his education. And in 1968, while he was attending FAU, he met and married a woman named Martha Fogg, and everyone called her Marty. And it was around this time that John's mental health issues really started to become obvious to other people. He started having feelings that what was happening around him wasn't real. Like he would just lose his sense of reality. He actually ended up writing a suicide note, which somehow made its way to the FAU campus psychiatrist, Dr. Raymond Killinger. And Dr. Killinger sent John to the FAU Testing and Evaluation Center just to have some psychological testing done. He did this under an emergency request. So he obviously thought that there was a serious need for help here. And while John was there, they found that he had low ego control, aggression, and that he had a problem blaming others for his own difficulties. They also found that he had severe issues concerning his father, which we already knew, and he had impairment of his sense of reality. And in the end, the doctors said that their findings were in line with psychotics and people with intracranial pathology. John was then referred to the Henderson Clinic, where he would remain under the care of a psychiatrist for a while. And during this time, John and Marty's marriage started to fall apart, and they eventually did split up. And John would say that the reason for this is that they had an incompatible sex life, and that he told her she needed to put out or get out. So Marty chose to leave, and by 1970 they were divorced. Marty would never really tell her side of things. All she would say is that she wanted to end the marriage because of extreme cruelty. So she just packed up and she left John and their dog and she moved out. I would have taken the dog, but that's just me. And this next part is scary to think about, but remember how I told you that John was an education major? Well, in 1969, he started applying for internships at local schools, and he ended up being accepted into the program and placed at Plantation High School. And as you probably guessed, this did not go well. John was supposed to intern at the high school from September 23rd to December 16th, but his time at the school was cut short. He ended up being removed from the internship program by the director when several parents started calling up at the school and complaining about John and saying he was a bad influence on their children. The faculty had also been really weirded out by him. It was just overall bad, so he was removed from that program. But this did not deter John. He actually ended up applying the next semester in the spring, and amazingly, he was accepted again. This time he was placed at Stranahan High School in Fort Lauderdale, where he would be student teaching a social studies class. And this second attempt didn't go any better than the first. And the social studies department head ended up writing a very long letter to the FAU education department about their impressions of John, which I won't read to you. But essentially the letter just said that John was not cut out for being a teacher. He had an aggressive way about him. He had an unpredictable nature. The students students didn't like him, and overall, he was just not cut out to be a teacher. So once FAU received this letter, John was finally removed from their education program completely. So right around the time that John was removed from the education program, he became very interested in capital punishment, but especially the act of hanging. He was just fascinated by it. He especially became interested in how people who are hung tend to evacuate their bowels and their bladder as they're dying. This was something that he became obsessed with, and proof of this obsession is obvious if you read his fictional crime stories. So we are now in 1970, and John is now divorced, and he's living on his own with his dog in this rundown little house in Fort Lauderdale, and he's been kicked out of the education program at FAU. And unfortunately, one morning while he was looking through the local newspaper, he saw an ad for a job that really caught his eye. This job would give John a position of power and authority, which is something that he definitely was interested in. And on September 1st, 1970, John responded to the ad and applied for the position of police officer for the city of Wilton Manors, which is a suburb of Fort Lauderdale. And 1 year after initially applying, John was finally hired on with Wilton Manors as a police officer. He was then enrolled in the Broward County Police Academy for further training and education in 1971, and John was loving this new life. He even got married for a second time to a woman named Teresa Dean in September of 1971. They had initially met at a grocery store, which is where Teresa was working at the time. She was a cashier, and she met John while he was shopping in the grocery store, and they had kind of a quick romance and got married pretty fast. During John's time at the police academy, he never really became close with any of the other officers, but he did manage to weird a lot of them out. John would constantly be talking about sex, and this was not just a fleeting mention between friends. This was very graphic, and he would just start talking about it out of nowhere. Like, there would be a group of guys, he would walk up and just start talking about these really explicit things, just totally out of context, and it would make the other officers uncomfortable. Then one day things got really weird when John pulled out a small black and white photo and he showed it to one of the other officers in the academy. This photo was of a dead woman's body, and this woman had been brutally murdered. John told this other officer that this photo was given to him by another officer, and it was actually from a crime scene. It's now believed that this could have been a photo of one of John's previous victims. Another time that John managed to really creep out the other officers was when he pulled out this weird looking set of handcuffs while they were all practicing handcuffing at the academy. And when the other guys asked John like where he got these strange looking handcuffs, he told them that he had actually got them from Africa. He said he had traveled through Africa at one point a few years before, and he had actually cut them off of a dead person's body. This person had been publicly executed, and John took the handcuffs after they were dead. I don't know if any of this stuff was reported to any of the superiors. I couldn't find anything on that, so I don't really know what was going through the heads of some of these other officers when he was telling them these things, but nothing seemed to be done about it. And John completed his training at the academy, and he worked for the Wilton Manors Police Department for a pretty short time, but he did manage to land a position as a deputy for Martin County Sheriff's Department. And it was during this time while he was working for the Sheriff's Department that he would make a mistake, and that would lead to all of his crimes coming to light. It all started on July 21st, 1972, and John Schaefer was just patrolling the local area when he spotted two hitchhikers near Jensen Beach. The two girls were Nancy Trotter and Paula Sue Wells, who went by Sue, and both girls were about 18 years old at this time. They were new to the area. They had only actually been in town for a couple of days, and they had decided to travel to Florida just to, visit the beaches and relax and get a suntan. They were just there to have fun. They were staying at a friend's apartment in the city of Stewart, which is in Martin County. And like a lot of people in the 70s, they mostly got around by hitchhiking. And this is what they were doing that day. They had spent that day at the beach, and they were just trying to hitchhike back to the apartment that they were staying in Stewart. And unfortunately, this is when they met John Schaefer. So when John saw the two girls on the side of the road, he stopped and he told the girls that it was illegal to hitchhike, which after my research, it doesn't sound like that was even true. It sounds like in that area of Florida, hitchhiking was actually not illegal. And in the areas where it was considered illegal, the laws weren't strictly enforced at that time. but the girls didn't know this. John offered to give the girls a ride home, and they accepted, and they got into the car. Nancy and Sue said that he was actually very nice to them while they were on the way back to the apartment, and he even offered to come back by the next day. They had plans to go to the beach again, and he said, I'll just come pick you up and I'll drop you off at the beach. That way you have a safe ride and you don't have to hitchhike. So they made plans to meet up the next day, and John left. So the next day, John shows up and he picks them up at a nearby park, which is where they had planned to meet. Except this time he was wearing normal clothes, like street clothes. And he wasn't driving his patrol car, he was driving a light blue Datsun. And when the girls asked him why he wasn't in uniform and in his patrol car, he said, oh, well, today I'm just working as a plainclothes cop. I'm just observing the area. And the girls accepted this explanation, and Nancy got into the front seat and Sue crawled into the back seat. And John started heading down the road. John asked the girls if they wanted to stop and see an old Spanish fort on the way. The girls said yes, so he turned off on this little dirt road that led to this wooded area on Hutchinson Island. Then they drove through the woods until they came to this Spanish fort, and they got out of the car and they kind of walked around it. They went inside, kind of checked it out a little bit, and the girls, they just wanted to get to the beach, so they were just kind of feigning interest in this Spanish fort. But eventually they tell John, we're ready to go to the beach, so they climb back into the car. But John didn't go anywhere. They were just kind of sitting in the car, and John started acting really strange. He started asking the girls all these random questions. He asked them about this halfway house that was near the apartment that they were staying in. He started asking them about drugs, like where can you find drugs in the Stewart area, all this stuff. And the girls didn't know. They had only been in town for a couple of days, so they didn't know the answer to any of the questions that he was asking them. At this point, they noticed that his whole demeanor had changed. He was no longer this calm, nice guy. He was almost aggressive. Then suddenly he just stopped asking questions, and he says, quote, I could dig a hole and bury you. No crime without a victim. The girls weren't really taking him seriously at this point, though. They were more just getting annoyed because it was extremely hot in this car. This is the middle of the summer in Florida, and they're just sitting in this hot car and they just want to go to the beach. But John wasn't showing any signs of leaving the woods. Then he tells the girls that he's going to have to put them under arrest because he's considering them runaways. He told Nancy to dump her purse out onto the seat of his car. He pulled out some handcuffs from between the seats. Then he forced the girls out of the car. He made them put their hands behind their backs and he handcuffed them. He then put the girls back into the car and he started just spouting off all kind of random things. He started telling them that he was going to sell them into white slavery. He started asking them if their parents would pay ransom, just really off the wall stuff. And he was getting really angry because he wasn't getting a significant reaction out of the girls. At this point, they had just kind of shut down. They just weren't talking anymore. So he forced them back out of the car. They're still handcuffed at this point. He opens up the trunk of his car and he pulls out rope and sheets. He had obviously come prepared to do something really bad to the girls that day. He then warned the girls that if one of them tried to run, he would kill the other one, and then he would track the one that ran down and he would kill her too. He gagged both of the girls, and then he brought Sue out to a nearby field and he tied her legs together, and then he looped the rope around her shoulders as well so she couldn't really move. Now, while all of this is going on, Nancy is handcuffed and she's gagged, but she still could have ran at this point. She wasn't tied up, but she was too afraid to run and she didn't want to leave Sue. So she just stood there and waited for John to be done dealing with Sue so he could come and tie her up. And once he had Sue tied up, he went and grabbed Nancy and he walked down to a nearby river, which was the Indian River that ran through this area of the woods. There were a bunch of trees in this spot. He tied her feet together and then he forced her to stand on this large above ground tree root, and then he placed a noose around her neck and then tied the rope to the tree. And once he had Nancy restrained to the tree, John warned her not to try to get away, and then he pinched her on her butt and he told her that if he wanted to, he could rape her right there. Then he just turned and walked away. So as soon as John was out of sight and Nancy felt like it was safe, she started trying to free herself. She was biting at her ropes. She was just kind of trying to wiggle her arms and her legs to see if she could kind of loosen things up. And she actually did end up getting free. It took her about 15 minutes, but she did free herself from the ropes. And this was very dangerous because if she were to have slipped off of that root, she would have hung herself. But she did manage to get herself free, but she did still have the handcuffs on. So once she was off of the tree, she started, just kind of looking around to make sure John wasn't anywhere in the area. And then she took off towards the river and she just got in. She started wading through the water and she was about knee deep at this point when she heard someone softly say her name. So she starts kind of looking around and she sees Sue. Sue is kind of far away from her though, but she can hear Sue calling her name. But Nancy was so afraid that it was just a trick and that John was forcing Sue to call her name and act like, she needed help so that Nancy would go back over there and he could grab her up again. So Nancy decided that the best thing to do was just leave and go get help and come back for Sue. So that's what she did. So she just continued to run through the water until she came near a clearing. And then she got out and she saw some bushes. At this point, she's still terrified that John is behind her. So she climbed into these bushes and she waited for 30 minutes just to make sure that he wasn't looking for her. Once she felt like it was safe to come out, that he really wasn't trying to find her, she eventually did come out of the bushes and now she's trying to find the road. She knew that the river ran parallel to the road. So she figured that getting back into the river was probably her best bet, that eventually if she started swimming, she would find a path to the main road. So that's what she did. She climbs back into the river. And this time she started swimming. She wasn't just running through the water, she was swimming. But remember, she's still handcuffed at this point. But luckily, Nancy was a really good swimmer and she knew just the way to position herself and how to move through the water in a way that didn't involve much use of her hands. And so this is what she did. She ended up swimming right into a bunch of jellyfish and she ended up getting stung twice while she was swimming. But she eventually did see the road, so she pulled herself out of the water and she just started screaming for help. And as soon as she came out of the water, a car pulled up and it was a Martin County Sheriff's Department car, which had to have been terrifying because she knows that that's where John works. But it wasn't John, it was actually Martin County Sheriff Robert Crowder. Sheriff Crowder was actually out looking for Nancy. About 45 minutes before Nancy found the road and came out and found Sheriff Crowder, Sue had actually managed to flag someone down. She had gotten untied and she managed to make it to the road before Nancy did. She flagged down a truck and of course this truck stopped. That's when Sheriff Crowder was notified and he came to the area and picked up Sue and took her back to the station. And of course, Sue told Sheriff Crowder all about Nancy and she told him that she was still out there and that somebody needed to go and help her. So Sheriff Crowder gets right back into his patrol car and heads straight back to where he had picked up Sue. And of course, that's when he saw Nancy crawling out of the river. Now, earlier that day, before Sheriff Crowder had picked up Sue or Nancy, before he even knew anything about Sue and Nancy, he received a phone call from none other than John Schaefer. And when Sheriff Crowder answered the phone, John just said, "I've done something foolish and you're gonna be mad at me." He told Sheriff Crowder that he had picked up 2 hitchhikers and he just wanted to teach them a lesson, teach them that, hitchhiking is dangerous. Anyone could pick you up and do whatever they wanted to you. So he just wanted to do something to freak them out so that they would just be, too scared to ever hitchhike again. And he said that he brought them out to the woods and he tied them up and he left them just to kind of give them a good scare, but that he planned to just come back and untie them and, take them where they needed to go. This was all just a lesson that he was trying to teach the girls. But Sheriff Crowder was not buying any of Schaefer's bullshit. And once he had Sue and Nancy's full account of what had actually happened, he immediately took action against John Schaefer. John was fired on the spot and then charges were filed against him. So it's a little unclear as to why John left the girls in the woods that day. I've read that he left them because he got a call on his police radio and he had to leave right at that moment. I've also read that he left them there on purpose as like psychological torture, sort of, just so they could think about everything that was getting ready to happen to them. I don't know why he left them in the woods that day. He had every intention of coming back and killing both of them. And based on some of his writings, he had some very disturbing plans in mind. And this is probably a good place to mention what some of his writings were about. The fiction that John wrote was extremely disturbing and graphic and honestly just sickening. And I feel like I can handle some pretty out there stuff, but this is just straight up vile. A lot of the stuff that he talked about involved taking women into the woods and tying them to a tree and torturing them before finally killing them and then committing necrophilia repeatedly in every way imaginable. And I'm not going to go into any more detail than that because I don't think YouTube would be very happy with me. But if you just really want to know and you're just morbidly curious, you can find a lot of John Schaefer's writings in the book Killer Fiction and the book Beyond Killer Fiction. There's also illustrations. You can find the illustrations online. Again, I don't recommend. Now, the girls later found out that that old Spanish fort that John had taken them to go see was actually not a Spanish fort at all. It was just a rundown shack that was in the middle of the woods. But he had just made up that story to lure the girls down there. And it's obvious that John has been to that area before because he knew exactly which dirt road to turn off on to take them to that shack. This whole thing was premeditated, and if Sue and Nancy hadn't escaped that day, there's no doubt in my mind that they would have been killed by John Schaefer. And he may have potentially never have even been caught, because it was this incident that eventually led to John getting caught and his story just really started to unfold. So after this, John was charged with 2 counts of false imprisonment and aggravated assault, but he was allowed to post bond at $15,000 and he was released pending trial. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Allowing John to post bond was a terrible mistake. John was out now, and now he was allowed the opportunity to hunt for more victims. And on September 27th, 1972, while John was out on bond, waiting for his trial, he abducted and brutally murdered 2 girls from Fort Lauderdale. The girls were 17-year-old Susan Place and 16-year-old Georgia Jessup. Susan Place was living with her parents in Oakland Park, which is a suburb of Fort Lauderdale, and she was new to the area. They had recently moved there from Detroit, and Susan had been a student at Stranahan High School, which, if you remember, was one of the schools where John had interned. But Susan struggled to fit in at Stranahan. She had epilepsy, and she also had slight paralysis to one side of her face from lack of oxygen when she was born. And she just found the kids at Stranahan to be kind of just snobby and stuck up, just not very welcoming at all. So she decided to leave public school and enroll at the Adult Education Center in downtown Fort Lauderdale to get her GED. And this is where Susan Place met Georgia Jessup. Georgia was attending the Adult Education Center to pursue her GED as well. Now, while the girls were attending the adult education school, they met and befriended a man named Jerry Shepard. Jerry said that he was 26 years old and he was from Colorado, but he was planning a trip to Mexico soon. He became pretty close with Georgia, and they would exchange letters, they would hang out, and he had even been to Georgia's dad's house before. Then on September 27th, 1972, Georgia and Jerry drove over to Susan's house to pick her up. The 3 of them told Susan's parents that they had plans to go to the beach that night, and they were just gonna, hang out and listen to people play guitar, stuff like that. Now, Susan's mom, whose name is Lucille, she had never met Jerry before. This was her first time meeting him. She had heard about him from Susan, but she never actually met him. And she felt uneasy about this guy. So before Susan and Georgia and Jerry left for the beach, she secretly went outside and she wrote down Jerry's license plate number, and then she wrote down the type of car that he was driving, a blue Datsun. Soon after that, the 3 of them left, and Lucille watched them drive off, and this would be the last time that she ever saw her daughter alive. And I'm sure that you've already guessed, but Jerry Shepard was actually John Schaefer. John took the girls out to the woods very close to the area that he had taken Sue and Nancy that summer, and he tied them up to a tree and brutally murdered them. On December 22nd, 1972, John went to court for the assault on Sue and Nancy, and he was convicted of 1 count of aggravated assault and sentenced to 1 year in prison with the possibility of parole after 6 months. And I don't know why this decision was made, but he was allowed to spend the holidays with his family. The sentencing was just a few days before Christmas, so the judge told him that he was allowed to go home, spend some time with them, spend the holidays with them, and then he was told to return to the prison on January 15th, 1973 to begin serving his time. And this would prove to be a huge mistake. Now, Susan and Georgia's parents had been frantically searching for them since they disappeared back in September of 1972. They had worked with police and they had went out on their own to search the area. They have driven all around to see if they could see anything, any clues about where their daughters had been. And Lucille had given the license plate number to the police pretty much as soon as they reported the girls missing. And she gave the description of the blue Datsun, but there was some sort of mix-up when they ran the plates, and they didn't realize this mistake until until March of 1973. And when they finally got the correct information on the car, they found out that it was registered to John Schaefer. The police had the girls' parents look through a photo lineup and they immediately picked Schaefer's photo. So police decided that they needed to go and question John. Now at this point, he was already serving his sentence for the assault on Sue and Nancy, so he was in prison already. Police go to the prison and they question him about the girls, but he, of course, denies even knowing who they are. Then on April 1st, 1973, some men were out looking for aluminum cans in the woods, and they discovered the badly decomposed, butchered bodies of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The bodies were found only 6 miles from where Sue and Nancy had been held captive by John the previous summer. And like I said, the bodies were in a very advanced state of decomposition, and they had been bound and mutilated with a knife or a machete, and both girls had been decapitated. The police also found body parts just kind of scattered all over the area, and one of the girls' torsos had been found bound to a tree. And as we know, this is John Schaefer's MO. The bodies were taken to the medical examiner's office and they were identified based on dental records, and the parents were notified. John Schaefer's name had already been linked to Susan Place and Georgia Jessup's disappearance when they found the car was registered to him. So as soon as he got word that the bodies had been found, he immediately asked for a public defender, who ended up being a man named Elton Schwartz. Now, based on all of this, a search warrant was obtained and police searched John's home, his car, and his mother's home as well. John's mother had a spare bedroom and John would use it to store personal items. And when the police opened up that bedroom, they found a treasure trove of evidence that would link Schaefer not only to Susan and Georgia's murders, but the murders of several other women as well. They found several knives and guns and really disturbing literature about torture and lots of personal items such as women's jewelry and clothing that did not belong to John Schaefer or anyone living in his mother's home. They also found a purse that was given to Georgia by her mother. Apparently, John had given this purse to his wife as a gift after he murdered Susan and Georgia. But as soon as the girls' bodies were found, he called his wife and told her to get rid of the purse. And just a quick note here, I haven't really talked about Teresa, John's wife, but it doesn't seem like she was involved at all. It doesn't seem like she knew about any of the stuff that he was doing. She seemed like a very passive type of person. She kind of just let John do whatever he wanted. She really didn't ask a lot of questions. During the search, they also found over 100 pages of writings and sketches done by John Schaefer depicting very disturbing things, mostly young women being mutilated and murdered. And like I said earlier, you can see these drawings online if you want to. So with everything found in the search, plus Susan and Georgia's parents' ID of John Schaefer, the license plate coming back as John Schaefer's car, there was enough to file murder charges. And he was indicted on May 18th, 1973 for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. And before John was allowed to stand trial, he was given a psychiatric evaluation. They found him to be extremely dangerous. In addition to his sexual perversions, he was also suffering from paranoid psychosis. But ultimately, he was found to be competent enough to stand trial. In October of 1973, Gerard John Schaefer was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But that is not where the story ends. John was only ever convicted of the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, but he's highly suspected in several other murders. So let's talk about some of the other victims, and we're going to go in order, and we're going to start in 1966 because it's believed that this is the year that John committed his first murder. October 2nd, 1966, 21-year-old Nancy Lechner and 20-year-old Pamela Nader were last seen alive in the Alexander Spring Wilderness area of the Ocala National Forest. They had been there with their boyfriends that day, but they decided that they were going to go hiking alone by themselves, and they were never seen again. Authorities initially believed that the girls had drowned, but John did later confess to their murders. September 8th, 1969, 24-year-old Lee Hainline Bonadies, John's childhood neighbor, one of the girls he used to spy on, she disappeared just 2 weeks after she got married. She told her husband that she was offered a job by an old friend and she was going to go drive to Miami to meet up with him, but she never came home. The family did hire a private investigator, and John was actually questioned about Lee's disappearance. Nothing really came of it. He admitted that he had spoken to Lee and that they were supposed to meet up, but he said he never heard from her. But during that search of Schaefer's possessions, a necklace was found that said Lee on it, and it was spelled Leigh, which is the way that Lee spelled her name. Lee's body was eventually found in Palm Beach County in April of 1978. December 18th, 1969, 22-year-old Carmen Hollick disappeared after telling her sister that she had an appointment with a male teacher from Broward Community College, and this teacher was trying to get her a job, which sounds a lot like Lee Hainline. Carmen was never seen again after she left for that meeting, and 2 of her teeth were actually found during the search of Schaefer's things. December 29th, 1969, 9-year-old Peggy Rand and 8-year-old Wendy Stevenson were last seen at Pompano Beach, headed towards a parking lot to go buy ice cream cones. They were seen with a strange man that kind of loosely fit Schaefer's description. Schaefer actually did confess to the murders of the girls in a letter to Sandra London, but his confession has been highly questioned. The girls definitely didn't fit his typical victim type, and the description of the man that was seen with the girls kind of sounded like him, but not really, and the girls have actually never been found. January 4th, 1972, 22-year-old Belinda Hutchins was last seen getting into a blue Datsun outside of her home. She's believed to have dated John for a short time. During the search of John's possessions, Belinda's address book was found, and inside the book, the name Jerry Shepard was there, which of course is the fake name that he had given to Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. February 29th, 1972, 13-year-old Deborah Sue Lowe disappeared. She was last seen walking to school, and Deborah's family believes that John was involved in her murder. John had actually worked with her father before. When she disappeared and then all of John's crimes came to light, the family really started to believe that he had some sort of involvement in her disappearance. But Deborah's body has never been found. October 26, 1972, 14-year-old Mary Alice Briscolina and 13-year-old Elsie Farmer were last seen hitchhiking to a restaurant. Their bodies were found near a construction site in early 1973, and they had both been decapitated. A gold chain and a Madonna medal that belonged to Mary Alice Briscolina were found during the search of Schaefer's things. December 23rd, 1972, 15-year-old Susan Poole was reported missing by her parents in Fort Lauderdale. Her remains were discovered on June 16th, 1974, tied to a tree on Singer Island in Palm Beach County, Florida. Her body remained unidentified until May of 2022, so just very recently, and she was finally identified through DNA testing. Due to the way her body was found, the fact that she was tied to a tree, and just the time frame in which she would have been killed, it's highly believed that she was one of Schaefer's victims.
Susan Poole was 15 when she disappeared in 1972. She lived at this trailer park, Pan America Estates on Andrews Boulevard in Broward County, but had been staying with a friend.
She disappeared right before Christmas. Nobody knew where she went. Her clothes, pocketbook were still at an apartment that she was staying.
Police now know it was her remains found 2 years later, deep in the mangrove trees off A1A on Singer Island, tied to a tree.
It appeared to be tied up in the mangroves with wire to a tree. She was a skeletal remains, totally nothing left of her except the bones.
The location and evidence making police think Poole could be a victim of Gerard Schaefer, a former cop and sheriff deputy turned serial killer.
The day that Susan Poole disappeared was just 1 day after John was sentenced for the assaults on Sue and Nancy. But as we know, he was allowed to return home for the holidays, and it's believed that the day after his sentencing, he abducted and murdered Susan. And finally, the IDs and birth certificates belonging to 2 missing 19-year-old girls, Colette Goodenough and Barbara Wilcox, were found in Schaefer's possession. These 2 girls had last been seen alive on January 8th, 1973, and it's believed that Schaefer abducted and murdered them on January 11th, 1973, which was just 4 days before he was supposed to report to the jail on January 15th to serve his sentence for the assault on Sue and Nancy. In 1977, the girls' remains were finally found in an area near Hutchinson Island, but no cause of death could be determined, so no charges were ever filed. And this has all been devastating to so many families, and to learn that a lot of these girls were killed by a man who should have been locked up already. If John would have never been allowed to post bond or to spend the holidays with his family before serving his 1-year sentence, so many lives would have been spared. That just has to be sickening for the families to think about. And there are other people that are suspected to be victims of John Schaefer's. John was sent to Florida State Prison to serve his life sentence, and this is where he became friends with a couple of other famous serial killers, Ted Bundy and Otis Toole. I know you've all heard of Ted Bundy, and you probably have heard of Otis Toole if you're into true crime, but for those who don't know, Otis Toole is another serial killer. He's most famous for admitting to the murder of John Walsh's son, Adam Walsh. John and Ted Bundy actually became pretty good friends while they were in prison, and John even said that he thought Ted had taken inspiration from his murders.
He told me that he had followed my case in the detective magazines, and that he had killed 2 girls in Washington as a copycat crime, so to speak, on the place in Jessup. And I think those were Ott and Naisland. He would tell me that he took them up on the logging road and strangled them and had sex with their corpses, and went back and had sex with their corpses and cut off their heads. Like, it's a tribute.
John's typical MO was to kill 2 women at one time, and he referred to this as doing doubles. And he said he thought that Ted Bundy had taken inspiration from him when Ted killed 2 girls at the same time. And remember John's high school girlfriend, Sandra London? Well, when she found out that John had been convicted of murder, she reached out to him about collabing on a book and having his writings published. The 2 of them ended up getting pretty close at this time. Sandra would go visit John in prison, and John would write her letters, and some of the letters he would write her, he would confess to murders. One of the letters read, "When I nabbed Jessup in place, I had been in the ghoul game for almost 10 years, so I knew what to expect from these juicy young creatures at the end. Doing doubles is far more difficult than doing singles, but on the other hand, it also puts one in a position to have twice as much fun. There can be some lively discussions about which of the victims will get to be killed first. When you have a pair of lively teenage bimbalinas bound hand and foot and ready for a session with the skinning knife, neither one of the little devils wants to be the one to go first. And they don't mind telling you quickly why their best friend should be the one to die." It's really messed up. Some of Schaefer's writings, he talked about how when he would have 2 victims at the same time, he would make them choose which one of them would die first. So this kind of goes hand in hand with what he wrote in some of his fiction writing. Sandra had a couple of books published with Schaefer, and I referenced them earlier. Those are the Killer Fiction and Beyond Killer Fiction.
The hangman's noose was placed over her head. Her terror must have blocked off the pain.
He's a cop turned killer, and he documented his deadly deeds on the blood-stained pages of this book.
I've always been a creative writer.
Exclusive Murder, he wrote.
Sandra and John's relationship ended abruptly, though, when John found out that Sandra was referring to him as a serial killer in the media. He didn't like that. He threatened to have Satan worshippers track her down and kill her. But after their friendship was over, Sandra managed to pick up the pieces and find another serial killer to focus her efforts on, the Gainesville Ripper, Danny Rolling. I know most of my fellow true crime addicts will know exactly who Danny Rolling is, but for those of you who don't, he was a serial killer who brutally murdered 5 college students in Gainesville, Florida in the early 90s. Sandra and Danny ended up getting engaged before Danny was executed in 2006. One other thing I thought was interesting to mention is that John's wife, Teresa, divorced him after he was convicted, and she ended up marrying his public defender, that lawyer Elton Schwartz, in 1973. Doesn't really have anything to do do with the case. I just thought it was interesting. John Schaefer spent over 20 years in prison confessing to murders and then retracting his confessions and then attempting to sue anyone who dared to call him a killer in public. He wasn't liked in prison at all. He had a reputation for being a snitch, and he was constantly being attacked by the other inmates. And on December 3rd, 1995, an inmate named Vincent Rivera stabbed Schaefer to death in his cell. It's believed that the two men had some sort of argument beforehand, and as soon as Rivera had the opportunity to kill Schaefer, he took it. And that was the case of Gerard John Schaefer Jr. I know that was a gruesome one. Go watch something happy. That's what I'm going to do. And if you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload content just like this every other Sunday. Thanks so much for watching this video and for hanging out with me today, and I hope you all have a great start to the new year. See you next time.